Settle in. This is Unintended Consequences, episode 22 for June 3rd, 2026. Today's profile: a policy that did the opposite of what its designers intended. On June 17th, 1971, President Richard Nixon stood in the White House briefing room and told the nation that drug abuse had become public enemy number one. The administration's plan was straightforward: use federal law enforcement to cut supply and punish demand so that addiction would shrink like any other criminal enterprise. Instead, the policy that followed produced the largest expansion of incarceration in American history, the rise of industrial scale trafficking organizations, and addiction rates that remained stubbornly close to their 1971 levels. Nixon and his advisors were responding to visible increases in heroin use among returning Vietnam veterans and in urban neighborhoods during the late 1960s. They viewed the problem as a national security and public order issue rather than a diffuse medical one. This view was consistent with the era's limited treatment infrastructure and the recent success of targeted enforcement against organized crime. Domestic Policy Chief John Ehrlichman later recalled that the White House believed strong criminal sanctions would reduce both the supply reaching American streets and the social disorder associated with visible drug markets. The approach also aligned with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which had already consolidated federal authority over narcotics. At the time, few models existed for scaling evidence-based treatment nationally, so criminal prohibition appeared to be the most direct lever available to a president facing re-election pressures over law and order concerns. Nixon formally announced the war on drugs in 1971 and created the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, while simultaneously expanding the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established, consolidating enforcement authority. Federal drug arrests rose from roughly 3,000 in 1970 to more than 10,000 within a few years. Early data showed temporary drops in street-level heroin purity in some cities and increased seizures along the Mexican border. Proponents pointed to these metrics as proof that supply could be constricted. Skeptics inside the public health community warned that enforcement would simply raise prices and profits for whoever remained in the trade. Those cautions received limited attention amid bipartisan support for tougher sentencing. By the 1980s and 1990s, mandatory minimum laws and the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988 drove state and federal prison populations from approximately 200,000 in 1970 to more than 1.2 million by 2000. The black market premium created by prohibition generated revenues that allowed Colombian and later Mexican trafficking groups to professionalize into multinational enterprises with private armies and diversified logistics. Domestic enforcement pressure displaced rather than eliminated production, shifting cultivation from Turkey and Mexico to more remote regions and later to fentanyl precursors from China. Families and communities experienced concentrated effects. By 2010, roughly 1 in 9 black children had a parent who had been incarcerated, most often for nonviolent drug offenses. Treatment capacity lagged because federal funding priorities remained tilted toward interdiction. Estimates from the era suggest that for every dollar spent on treatment, roughly 10 went to enforcement. Second-order effects included the militarization of local police departments through asset forfeiture programs and the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods most heavily policed. Cartels adapted faster than agencies could respond, turning enforcement pressure into a barrier to entry that rewarded only the most sophisticated organizations. By the 2010s, states began rolling back some mandatory minimum statutes and expanding drug courts and treatment access, while several jurisdictions legalized cannabis. The Obama and Trump administrations each reduced the federal crack cocaine sentencing disparity and redirected modest additional funds toward treatment. Ehrlichman's 1994 interview remarks, published in 2016, crystallized retrospective criticism from inside the original policy circle. Nevertheless, the core architecture of prohibition and aggressive supply-side enforcement persists at the federal level. New unintended consequences have appeared. The rapid spread of fentanyl, a drug far easier to conceal than plant-based narcotics, has driven overdose deaths above 70,000 annually, even as incarceration rates have begun to decline. Some localities that abruptly reduced enforcement without simultaneous treatment expansion saw open-air markets reemerge, illustrating how partial reforms can create fresh gaps. When a policy defines a complex behavioral and medical problem primarily as a criminal supply issue, the resulting incentive structure rewards those who can operate most effectively outside the law. Complex social phenomena resist single lever interventions. Enforcement pressure tends to concentrate profits among the most adaptable actors rather than eliminating the activity. Decision makers today can test whether proposed solutions address root demand and whether enforcement mechanisms contain built-in adaptation advantages for illicit networks. How might current regulatory or enforcement proposals in other domains, housing, migration, or digital platforms, shift incentives in ways that reward the very behaviors they aim to suppress? That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who would appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts covering tech, science, markets, and more. If you enjoyed today's episode, give Fascinating Frontiers a listen, the most fascinating news from space and science. You can explore the whole lineup at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.